I'm just going to outline briefly where next for sovereign wealth funds and develop the theme a little bit further. The idea that we've had, in a sense, a very fast period of growth is truly out there. And from a standing start in 1953, the Kuwait fund was the number one. We actually got to about 40 funds by the middle of the last decade, 2005. And we're now at 60 funds. So that's 20 funds being put on in roughly 6 or 7 years, essentially. And the conversations that are taking place are suggesting that there are a number more to come. So when we think about the future here, we think about a number of countries that actually see the advantage to deploying some of their excess surplus, if they have an excess surplus, big issue, in this type of very focused financial fund. Growth levels in sovereign wealth funds, the fastest of any of the investment types. And from 5 trillion today, near enough, projections would place it above 10 trillion by 2015. Essentially, that's more than a doubling is likely in the next 5 years, essentially. So that's why these funds attract a lot of attention from the industry in terms of services. And of course, the traction that they can have with where they invest is going to be more considerable over that period of time. The sense of wider purpose that they may serve, and there are interesting thoughts about what might be the purpose of future sovereign wealth funds, and also where they're going to be sourced from. And one of the interesting things about the pensions world is that the public sector in many countries is kind of looking a bit like a sort of slow motion train wreck, if you will. And of course, we know something about that in the UK, and we look forward, if we work in London, to November the 30th as one of those sort of those important events that remind us that we have major issues about the effectiveness of the pension system, particularly in the public sector. And these types of funds can serve that purpose. How these funds collaborate, it's obvious that wide sweeps of the finance sector, it's so much more about competition. It's survival of the fittest. But there's two aspects of sovereign wealth fund behaviors where collaboration really truly does serve their purposes extremely well. One is that they can satisfactorily meet their different strategy needs through the application of the investment quantity beta, the market allocations. So it is possible for funds to be complementary in terms of how they meet their overall goals without competing as they have to in the alpha space. And so forms of collaboration, forms of comparing notes about how they go about strategy is very, very common here. The other area is really about their ownership interests, and it bears upon the word sustainability. Essentially, these funds have very considerable ownership interests when added together. Essentially, Norway is the best example of this, which actually is over 1% of every share pretty much out there. And if Norway adds its muscle alongside several other funds in deployment of superior shareholder value, whatever that might be, and actually works harder to adjust the strategies that may not be working in today's environment. So there are very interesting opportunities for these funds to operate in that sort of collaborative fashion. The last one, I think, is very much there, that these are so much in the public eye, and from that point of view, their transparency has become more of an issue. If you do look at some of the more recent sovereign funds, these have been the ones that have been 100% transparent, almost to the point where it looks like they're giving away some of their savvy, their know-how. So the disclosure every manager they have is on the New Zealand website, on the Australian website. These are situations where the sunshine principle is very much being applied, that by being completely open, these funds actually put pressure on themselves to do a better job. That's the principle. It's a principle I believe in, but certainly there are many other funds that have found it a little bit more difficult to reveal how they operate. Now, some of these are the larger ones, and so from that point of view, it is quite interesting, as an example, to look at GICs of Singapore attempts to disclose quite a lot more about its strategy relative to what it's doing in the past. That's because of public interest, accountability, and what I've referred to before as the Santiago principles, which are principles of operation, which are critical to the future of these funds working to the same sort of team sheet. Now, I just wanted to finish really with something that is a little bit bigger picture. Busiest slide last. And in some respects, I think it does come back to many of John's questions that he kicked off with, that essentially what we are doing is living through extraordinarily challenging times. And what's captured here, think of it as a clock face, if you will, are the big picture issues. I call this new reality. This is a bit similar to what PIMCO would call a new normal, but it is essentially a number of things that are kind of fresh and different and have followed the global financial crisis. And if you think of it as a clock face, think of it from 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock, those are the new macros in terms of multipolar geopolitics and the macroeconomic condition of the world, which is different and stretched, basically. Those are the big things that are happening down the right-hand side of the clock face. And then 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock, capital market expansion and fiduciary capitalism. This is the new financial order. And capital markets are absolutely key to a number of aspects of our future, and their expansion is assured. That said, there are issues about them. And in many respects, what I call the fiduciary capitalism trend is towards these big asset owners. And I've been talking about the 5 trillion that represents the sovereign wealth funds, but I can talk very quickly about the 25 trillion that represents pension funds, the 22 trillion that represents insurance companies. I could go on. These are funds that are managed on behalf of others as fiduciaries, recognizing a very responsible attitude. And how they deploy that influence is becoming a much larger factor in our world. And so fiduciary capitalism has pretty much replaced the agency capitalism, the financial capitalism, which actually was more dominant through the last decade or two. So if you will, it's not so much the private equity and the hedge fund managers that are so influential now. It is these asset owners that I speak of. And top of the clock face, 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock, the secular stresses. And these sorts of challenges are actually significant long-term challenges that we have on top of everything else. So I really did want to finish on a high in terms of extreme optimism. But that picture is very tough to get hold of, and it really will stretch us. But in a world of that sort of extraordinary challenge, it will be for business and private enterprise to be making the difference. Essentially, that will happen through markets, and the markets will mobilize the capital for the task. And if we actually see that as some sort of chain through the system that actually works better, we have actually a much more optimistic conclusion. I've had to do this quickly, and I don't want to eat into your later drinking time, but what I will just finish with is that optimistic statement that the sovereign wealth funds have the opportunity and the challenge to be seen more as the good guys in future. So thank you very much.